You're listening to Ask Your Autis, a Filipinx mental health podcast. I'm Mercado Martinez, and I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist.
And I'm Cynthia Siadat. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. And this podcast is for our Filipinx community, our kapatids, our adings, and younger us.
A little disclaimer. So the information contained on this podcast is for educational and informative purposes only, and it's not intended or implied to be a substitute for professional mental health. This content is not intended to be a replacement for therapy, diagnosis, treatment, advice, or psychological care.
This podcast does not constitute a therapeutic relationship and is not implied to be professional mental health, medical, legal, or other advice. These platforms are intended to provide education about mental health, psychology, and general therapy information.
If you are in a crisis, please call 911 or visit your nearest emergency department. If you're not in immediate danger, but would like someone to speak with, you can reach the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255.
Lastly, the content of our conversations can be challenging, triggering, and at times downright upsetting. I think I speak for Michelle and I both as your autis, that we want you to give yourself permission to take care of you. If you find something is bothering you, a thought, feeling, or body sensation, go ahead and get up to take care of it. Drink water, use the restroom, take a nap, and come back later if you want to. We'll be here. Another important thing, it takes a village and we could not do this alone. We, your ates, acknowledge our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrieleño, Tongva, and Luiseño peoples. We acknowledge the Gabrieleño, Tongva, and Luiseño peoples as the traditional land caretakers of the Los Angeles Basin, Southern Channel Islands, and Riverside County. We pay our respects to the ancestors, elders, and our relatives, past, present, and emerging, and encourage all of our kapatid to visit tongva.land today to make a guest offering either one time or on a monthly basis. And if you're curious and want to know what native land you may be on to make an offering to those traditional caretakers, please visit native-land.ca. Welcome, kapatid. This is your ates Cynthia and Michelle. And today's podcast is about decolonization in relationship to mental health, a continuation of the conversation we started last episode. And we're going to get started with Michelle doing a grounding exercise for us. Michelle?
Okay. All right. So I want to invite everybody to sit comfortably and close your eyes. Place your feet firmly on the floor. Gently start to slow down your thoughts and allow them to come to a pause. Notice the rise and fall of your chest as you inhale and exhale. Allow yourself to welcome your ancestors into this space. Take a moment to honor those ancestors who have come before you, those who are still with you, and those whose memories have made lasting impact on you. Allow their faces to come to your mind. Allow yourself to experience the warmth of connection to and with them. Allow yourself to receive what your ancestors have always dreamed for you. Notice how they look at you with wonder. Notice how they surround you with care. Notice their strength. Connect to their knowing. Align yourself to the power of what has been passed down generation to generation. Though some of our ancestors were never able to fully access that power, this is where our turn starts. This is where the cycle changes. This is where our healing passes through us to heal down through our ancestral lines. Stand firmly in this knowing. And now I invite you to take a moment to reorient yourself, to get yourself grounded, and to be present with us and all of our parts as we get ready for this much needed discussion on decolonization. So we're just going to dive right in because we'd be talking about gatekeeping. Cynthia, I'm wondering if you could tell our kapatid, how is it when you were growing up? Like, how did your parents teach you? Like, I mean, even in this context, we'll look at like right and wrong first, but how did they guide and direct that for you?
By scolding. There weren't really explicit conversations about what was right and wrong. It was more trial and error for me, and then their sort of authority stepping in depending on whatever I did. So like, let's see, I'm trying to think of an example. Like, I was at like an elementary school. There in our elementary school, there were like basketball teams and stuff and games. I went to my sister's games and like would just hang out with my friends who were in my grade level. And I remember I was like sitting on the ground and like must have been either in like a partial like cross-legged position or like something where my knees weren't together.
Yeah.
And like I remember we were just hanging out, having a good time, and my mom walks by and she walks next to me and like kneed my knee like to close my legs. And she was like, young lady, like she was like, you need to sit properly, young ladies don't sit like that. And I was like, oh, okay. And so like I remember feeling so much shame, so much embarrassment. I remember feeling super like hot to the touch, like hot temperature wise.
Yeah.
And I remember like my friends got quiet, I got quiet, and then my mom left. And I was like we were quiet for a while. There was like a big old pause. And I just remember, being taught in that moment had me associate like shame and pain and embarrassment for getting something wrong that I didn't even know was wrong.
Yeah.
You know, I like now, I don't think that's wrong. I think that's perfectly fine. And I know that, you know, old school mom, you know, traditional mom was like, that's not how ladies sit. So yeah. So that's an example. But what about you?
Yeah, so I did have a lot of the shame-based stuff. But what really stuck out to me was that my parents used a lot of fear. Fear-based tactics in don't do that, you're going to get kidnapped. Don't do that, you're going to get hurt. And everything was like, I needed to be scared of this world because me as, you know, younger self, little person wouldn't be able to handle any of the things outside of the home, even sometimes in the home, right? But everything was like, don't do that because, and it was working through my parents' own anxiety, but I didn't know it as that early on, right? So it's just, they just created this really strong model of fear within me of, and that's not even just like learning right from wrong. This was like, you know, fear of authority too.
Yeah.
So it was this idea of the world is fucking scary and you're going to get consumed by it was how I read it now.
Yeah.
And so I think about this and how it's informed how I move throughout the world. And it's even come up, like, I see this with my daughters and how I've had to be different. Because I remember there were moments where it was like, don't do that, you're going to be embarrassed. Right. So it's like, fix what you're wearing because that's embarrassing. I was like, shit, like, damn, okay. Whereas now I can see how I want to teach my girls that it's like, the world is fucked. Yes. And let me teach you how to stand firm in who you are, because it doesn't matter what anybody else is going to say. And that's what I really wish that I had from them, of like, it's not, the world is scary. That's great. But then you didn't teach me how to live and maneuver
like do something with it.
Yeah. Right. But then it made me think of like, okay, but then what was the experience like for them? What are the things that they had to fear themselves that they also didn't have guidance and direction? Because when we look at like the whole colonization process, right? Like how much fear is unmetabolized in our ancestors.
I mean, I feel like that fear, and I speak a lot about my mom specifically because she and I probably had the most conversation between me and my parents. Like my dad was my dude, but like my mom and I actually like talked about stuff. And like I remember like I was sharing in last episode about my grandparents and how they were revolutionaries and how I'm so proud. And that is information that my mom did not have when she was growing up and didn't have until I started doing the family research. And like but in my childhood, she had a great deal of like, don't talk about your grandparents, don't talk about this, don't talk about that, because she and my aunts had lived through, my mom was here in the States when it happened, but had lived through martial law in the Philippines, where people were literally being kidnapped or killed for speaking out, for sharing, for talking, for speaking against, whatever was happening with the Marcos era. And so my mom to this day is very scared. Less so, I guess. And even as I'm speaking it, I'm like, oh yeah, she had told me like, be careful what you say out in public, because we don't know who is still listening and who is still advocates for this person in the Philippines and that person in the Philippines. And like, there was that around this topic in specifics or around our family history. But I think like the everyday stuff was a lot like that example. So like, it sounds like your parents were like, don't do that. You can get kidnapped. Don't do that. And I think my mom said stuff like that. But I think more oftentimes it was really, really that trial and error thing of like reaction, like not like no preempting, nothing. It was just very reactionary. I remember we went to the grocery store in downtown Vallejo, and we picked up a paper bag full of crabs. I wanted to say blue crabs, but I don't actually know if they were blue crabs. They were crabs, and they were live, as they are, from time to time. And I'm carrying the bag, and I like sling it over my shoulder. I didn't realize what was in the bag. And I sling it over my shoulder, and sure enough, one of the crabs like grabs the back of my arm and like pinches me. And I that was the first time I cursed in front of my mom.
Oh no!
And I was
okay.
And I think I don't remember if I said fuck or shit, but I said one of them. And she was like, "Hoy, no, don't say that. That's not But I was like, one, I had just experienced like literal physical pain. And so it was like a reaction out of my own pain. So it's like, I understand now there's not a whole lot of control in those moments where we're reacting like that. And then like the shame of having a valid but very uncontrolled emotional reaction that swiftly came after that was intense. And I think really taught me a lot about like, when I have big emotion or when I have something that feels uncontrollable, I can't be cursing of it or complaining of it. I can just it's basically like she never said this, but the takeaway I had as a young person was like, if I'm suffering, I suffer alone.
Yeah.
So let me see.
I was just talking to my mom about that. Actually, she was, I forgot what exactly brought up this conversation. She was actually asking me something about emotions, and I was like, okay, we're going to go there. And I think she was asking generally about community and emotions. And I was like, okay, well, let's talk then about how emotions have been dismissed, typically speaking, or like y'all would get mad if I was anything but happy or polite.
Yeah.
Right. And it was like I was having this conversation and seeing her try to process it. And I could tell that she was getting activated because like her voice was starting to like raise. But it was the wildest thing because I was like, I'm in my element. We're talking about emotion. I'm here. Let's do this. Like, what do you want to know?
Yeah.
And she was, she was like bringing up like, oh, but you can't be angry and da 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 da. And I was like, actually, no, you really need to be angry.
Yeah,
like that is a totally valid emotion. And it was so interesting to see her trying to process through emotions, knowing that we are a very emotional, like, culture,
people,
but we don't speak about it. Right. So, that was just, it was really eye-opening because it also reminded me of the time when she wanted to talk about colonization with me. And I was like, oh, okay. Wow. So we really want to do this. Okay. But it was more so talking about colonization of like, yeah, but your dad and I made the best decision we could by not staying in the Philippines. Like we just thought that you guys would have an easier life, which I totally understand. And again, there is that piece of honor, but they just weren't prepared for what I was going to be experiencing, having to straddle Filipino culture, Filipinx culture, and American culture, and what that would do for me internally in trying to reconcile the two, right? Because from my parents' perspective, or I should say, I haven't really talked colonization and any of that stuff with my dad, but more so with my mom. She always saw colonization as something that was really beneficial. And I was like grabbing my seat, like, what is happening here? How could you be telling me that colonization is like a really good thing? And so I had to get, she knows some of my mental health journey, but I also don't know if she could handle all of it. So I've had to like spoon feed some of this information. And she didn't realize how much colonization and adapting like even dominant culture views, how that othering of myself really impacted my self-esteem, and how there are so many times that I just hated so many things about me because I was different. Yeah. And so she didn't have to see that side. She didn't have to experience that, right? It's like, it's around people that looked like her. And so it was just like, oh, but there's so much opportunity. It's like opportunity, yes, but there was also a cost. And the cost was the way that we had to experience the world. So those were two pretty big conversations I didn't think I was ever really going to have.
I mean, that just reminds me of like this pervasive, like idea of like scarcity.
Yes.
It brings that up for me. I think the idea of like there's not enough of something to go around. And so therefore it's like, oh yeah, of course, it's like there's a sacrifice here. Of course there's something we had to give up. And I wanna credit both our families for like what they did have to give up, but I don't know that it's talked about like this, but in my view, I think it sounds like, just giving up part of themselves for new parts of themselves that started to become incorporated when they maybe immigrated here.
Yeah.
And like, I just feel, I don't know, like I'm just imagining, because I didn't grow up with my cousins. Like I had my mom was very clear. It's the five of us, me, my two sisters, and my dad and my mom. It's the five of us. We don't have your extended family close by. It's us. And that in and of itself felt really scarce because I was like, I was also like the youngest by 5 and 7 years. So by the time I was like being able to have certain conversations, like my sisters were in college or in high school or, just somewhere else.
Yeah.
So I was like, okay, but I don't get to talk to anybody about like what's happening with me emotionally. Like, just like nobody else does this. And for a long time, I was the person in my family that my family members would be like, oh yeah, Sin goes to therapy. Mm-hmm. Sin needs therapy. Oh yeah, Sin's not doing well. It's like that kind of talk versus like getting to acknowledge how they were doing. I think that part feel like even like that scarcity thing is like pervasive in my mind around like the focus has to be on somebody else. And because it's on somebody else, it cannot be on me too. So that feels like a thing that I navigated for a long time. So I'm really like, oh, young me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that we can't talk about scarcity without talking about crab mentality.
Yeah.
Right. Because they just go so hand in hand.
Yes.
When I started doing like different speaking things and I was letting my parents know that, I was letting my mom know, my dad kind of just hears from my mom sometimes these things. He's gulping and such, living that retired life.
Yeah.
But so I was telling her, I was like, yeah, I really want to make sure that I can give back to the community. I want to make sure that I focus on health and mental health for our community. Mm-hmm. And she looked at me and she's like, well, I just don't want people to say things. It's like, what do you mean? And she's like,
what kind of things?
tell me more about these kinds of things you think people are going to say. But it was like this whole idea that she has where because I think that I think that there's somewhere along the lines that she experienced that crab mentality. And so she thinks that my experience of being in a Filipino space would be one where I would just be ridiculed, not listened to, judged, any of those pieces. Because she actually said, she's like, I just think it would be different if it was like, maybe like a white space. Like, oh my.
Wow.
Yeah. Right. Okay. And so,
yeah. So I mean, I get that. I get that. I mean, like as you were sharing about your mom's, it sounds like an internalization of that crab mentality, it's like somebody's going to talk shit. It's like somebody's going to say something negative about you in this community, and that I want to acknowledge as a personal experience because I know that that was part of what had separated me from the community or made me want to separate from the community was like being shit talk about. Either by other Filipinas or Filipinos in the like of peers or their parents.
Yeah.
And like that being something that I was just like, I'm not down with that. I'm still not down with that. I still think that like chismis, cut it out. It's like talk to if you can't say it to the person, don't say it. And I think the around crab mentality, when we talk about like, if so crab mentality being somebody else gets something good in their life, there's like this whole, it's that idea of like bucket of crabs, like pulling that one crab down that's like successfully getting out of the bucket. It's like if I can't have it, they can't have it. And like, I don't know that that's like a thought that I've ever had with malice, but I know that that's a thought I've had with like envy. It's like, oh, so-and-so got this speaking engagement, for instance. I'm like, yeah, I'm not going to be that ever. Like, that's kind of like how it translates in my mind. And I have to be really conscious about, like, aware of that because I think I'm trying to get into the practice of remembering like that is there. That's one opportunity of more. And I think that is, that's a bit of healing. I think that's a large bit of healing, I think, that I've had to do.
Yeah. I'm thinking about when I do experience that for myself. And I think that one thing I'm really thankful for, especially with our kapatid that has been doing their work, is that I see and I've seen a shift from crab mentality of how are we all lifting each other up. Right. And so for me, that's why it was so different to hear my mom say that perspective of like, oh, but this is what's going to happen versus knowing like what I've been experiencing
in this community now.
Yeah, in this community and how I've seen shift and growth in, I think it's less about that. And I think it's more about like, hey, how are we all going to start lifting like our community up?
Yeah.
And how can we start supporting each other?
Yeah.
And I'm glad that that's where we're at now.
Yeah. Yeah. I wonder when you're thinking about that, and I wonder, does that come into parenting for you?
Oh, yes. I feel like my kids are always going to be an example in this podcast. Right. Because I think that so earlier I was talking about how I have to revisit conversations about what am I doing that might be making them more fear-based. Because I know that there used to be some things that I was like, what is that really coming from? So I'll give the example. So my kids still do virtual school, which I love. There's so much more flexibility with that. But there was this piece of my daughter was wanting to wear the same like clothing every single day. And my mind automatically took me to like, oh, I would have gotten made fun of if I was in school.
Sure.
And I would have done that. Right. And so then I had to step back because I think it was actually, of course, it's always my partner that has to get me to freaking stop and like reflect on these things. Because I was like, oh, no, but you wore that yesterday and you don't want people to like make fun of you or do any of that. And my partner was like, but what if they did? And
it was fine.
Yeah, it's fine. And so then it was like, oh shit, yes, you're right. And so then now it's more so thinking about what are these things that I was taught growing up about how to fit in, how to be accepted. So again, like going back to that fear of like, you don't want to be made fun of. Right. You don't want to be kidnapped. You don't want to do this and that. And I don't want to create that world for my kids anymore. I want to make sure that they understand that, yeah, they might have differing views from other people and that's okay. So I have to give
that reaction. I mean, you've essentially given such a perfect example of how the intention of something, the intention of that behavior from you, what I'm hearing is like, it's an intention to protect them from the pains that you had experienced. Yes. You don't want them to experience that embarrassment or humiliation. It's like that kind of intention. Now, the way to go about it is something that you have had modeled in a certain way. So like I'm really curious when you think about creating a different model, or, if you have a different model that you have been using or trying with your kids, like, I'm curious, what does that sound like instead of you don't want to do that because you don't want to be embarrassed or people will make fun of you. What's the alternative?
So for me, I actually like to look at a lot of this through an attachment lens. Right. And so, when we look at like the basics of attachment, we're just looking at how am I showing up consistently and how am I available to meet. And I like to look at this in terms of emotional needs, because I think physical needs, those are more than covered usually. Right. So when we're looking at consistency and availability, I know that I need to show up differently in this way, but I have to also recognize that when I'm looking at attachment and I look at like my attachment to my parents, that was very anxious attachment based versus like secure attachment. So it was always like, I need to act or do or be a certain way in order to, have safety and protection, all of those beautiful things. Right. Whereas I don't want my daughters to know that. I don't want my daughters to feel like, hey, they need to show up a certain way. I want them to know, like, no matter what, like I'm still here. And I want to say, like, it's never that the threat was real. Like my parents weren't available. I mean, they weren't available emotionally sometimes. Right. But like they did do what they could do to take care of me. But I want to make sure that I move from that perspective of like, okay, I'm just going to meet your physical needs. Right. To, hey, physical needs are also important, but let's make sure that we meet your emotional needs. Let's build some emotional intelligence. Let's make sure that we don't continue this anxious attachment pattern that's been passed down. I don't know if we'll have time to discuss it here, but I do think that there is a strong connection to anxious attachment and our colonial past. So, and that's something that I'm honestly still exploring myself, how those two are linked. But I know that they're linked. I'm still feeling through it myself.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I really thank you for that example, because I do think that anxious attachment, like you're saying, is connected. I mean, like if I think about the colonialization through the Japanese of that era of my grandparents and my mother's time, when she was a little one, the anxious attachment or just the total lack of attachment came as a direct result of colonization. Like they had to be separated because there was a bounty on both of my grandparents' heads.
Yeah.
And they had to be separated. And it wasn't like there was nothing sort of metaphorical about it for them. It was very, very much like we have to be separate. And that led to its own kind of repercussions for my mom. It was like she struggled with feeling unwanted, and she struggled with feeling anxious, and like it shows up even still, like with some of her grandchildren and her interactions with them. And I do think that we, as I think about my own healing and I think about decolonization work, I'm thinking about how as I heal my stuff, as I heal my own connection with myself, with my family members, with my ancestors, if I heal those, if I'm healing my connections, I can help heal the wounds of previous ancestors past.
Yeah.
And I think part of that I'm seeing happen as I'm trying to improve my connection to my ancestors. My mom is getting curious. She's not afraid to learn more. She's still a little afraid of the repercussions of talking about it publicly, but she is not, she's like curious. She like wants to know what I'm finding out, what I'm learning. I met this amazing woman who had interviewed my maternal grandmother before she passed. And like, without ever having known this woman, without never having met her, without ever having like seen her in person, but only reading the interaction she had with my maternal grandmother, I feel now connected to this person and my grandmother.
Yeah.
And like my mom is just, she's sort of the co-recipient of that connection. Because the more connected I am and she's connected to me, the more like healing can happen for her.
Yeah. So y'all, Cynthia's going to have a session in just a minute. So I want to make sure that we wrap this up.
Oh, girl, I've got like 10 minutes. So I'm good.
But one thought, and this, I don't think this is going to get answered today because this is just a big curiosity that I'm holding for myself is if we had to experience an anxious connection to our land, meaning with colonization, how could we create that secure attachment? It was something that's supposed to be ours, and then it gets taken by others. So if it starts there, if it starts with, the Spanish and the United States getting together and trying to figure out how do we take this from, how are we ever supposed to know security in that, right? And so this is just still a big question that I have of like, I don't understand how we would have ever really been able to create security back then with all of the insecurity of the time, with all the So like, that's still like, something I'm processing through.
Totally. I mean, it's similar. It's similar for me around like, how could my mom have taught me secure attachment if she didn't have secure attachment? She didn't get to, and neither did my grandparents. It's like that, like for generations, like we're talking about Spanish and American colonization of the Philippines. But then there's also like the Japanese occupation and other Asian, or I don't know if they were all Asian colonizers, but other colonizing peoples that came into the Philippines. It's really tough to try to go back there. And I do think, while I did mention like, my individual healing, I feel like is part of helping to heal and having generational trauma stop with me. I do think that the challenge of that, I think sometimes I forget that all of my ancestors, all of the family history, all of that our society's history, all of that is in me in one way, shape, or form. And if I just focus on healing here, I can emanate that essentially wherever I go, so that it's like, it might not be like the healing touch. I'm not Jesus, but like, it's like, it's like, just like being able to provide this healing space and being able to be truthful about like when something of mine isn't healed. Like I don't know all of my family history. I've only been digging into like my mom's side, not even my dad's side, which he's from Ilocos Sur, that side of the family. And that's traditionally been a site of Spanish colonization. So I have no idea what all is entailed there. But I think the de-emphasizing on there's a place to arrive is important. That's something that I want to share with folks on their own journey, is like try to de-emphasize that there's a place you need to get to. And I'm saying that as somebody who's struggling with that, not as somebody who like has mastered it. I haven't mastered it. I'm just trying to share the thing that I've learned. Because I think it's like that milestone situation. I talk with my clients a lot about how we were taught to like go by milestones, is like we graduate and then we go to college and then we graduate again and then we get a job and then we find our partner and then we get into our careers, buy a house, have some kids. It's like there's all of these things, but like all of those things only last like this much time. It's like and you can't see me, but I'm like pinching the air between my index finger and my thumb. And like, it is so short and so short-lived. And then we're taught to then go, what's the next thing? Instead of being able to expand upon and really thrive and savor the in-between. Because we spend most of our time in the in-between.
This is so real, because that's exactly what I work on, not just in my therapeutic space, but for myself personally, because I think that there is this idea of there's always a goal, right? And so I always have to hold for myself process over goal.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Because you're right, like goals will only last you so long. And then I know that I sat with that for a really long time. And it was always like, okay, but what's next? What's going to make me good enough? What goal do I have to hit next to be good enough? And I was like, wait a second. Nope, that's not the right framework. That doesn't work for me anymore.
We start good enough. We start as babies good enough. We didn't stop being good enough. We just like learned somewhere along the way that we weren't. And like we're both good enough and not. It's like I will not be a good enough basketball player for the NBA. That's not a thing. I'm short. I don't have great coordination of my hands and my feet. It's like that's not a thing. And I am good enough in other spaces, in other areas of life. I'm a good enough mom. I'm a good enough wife. I'm a good enough friend, good enough clinician. I had a therapist once who like encouraged me to be like, I am the best clinician in the world. Like, and I had such a hard time.
I'm having a reaction to that.
Like, I had a hard time. I had a really, really hard time. But if I think in confronting that phrase, I was like, but just because I'm the best clinician in the world doesn't mean that I'm the best clinician for everybody. I'm the best clinician in the world for the people who resonate with my style.
Yep.
And that was something that I could embrace. I could embrace being the best for a person in a particular moment. I could embrace that nuance. I couldn't embrace being like, I'm the best ever. So like bringing that nuance, I think, has been really helpful for me to, just integrate all of these different parts of me.
One thing I want to make sure I share with our kapatid here is that when anyone is looking at the decolonization process for themselves, this is overwhelming, period. Hard stop. And at the end of the day, this is going to go back to that like goal versus process, right? Where it's like, if we can be in alignment with our process and not see this as something that needs to be goal oriented, that's the sweet spot. Otherwise, we will hit the overwhelm. And I know I did it. I was like, when I said to that, my therapist, I was like, I need all this internalized depression out of me now, right? Because that was the goal.
Yeah.
But now I'm just thinking it's like, this is a process. And if anything, when you want to start this process for yourself, even if you are in this process for yourself, make sure that there's an ample amount of self-compassion that you take with you through this, because there's going to be a lot of things that you are learning and unlearning can be overwhelming, especially to like all of like our nervous system, our senses, all of that. So we can just be gentle and compassionate as we continue to unfold our decolonization process for ourselves.
Yeah. I think to answer that question, I'd like to like tell someone, whether you're an individual or a clinician or whomever, who's trying to embark upon decolonization of self, is just knowing that it took time to arrive to be the person that you are. And it will take time to both unlearn and learn new things. It is not overnight. It is not, it's like when I'm speaking with clients and I'm like, oh, I didn't know this about you. Well, of course I didn't know this about you. The range of age for my clients is like 24 to 40 plus, It's like there are a lot, like I can work with people for many years, but that is not 20 plus years close. That's like really, really a lot for me to learn and sit with not knowing about a person. And so same goes for when any of our kapatid, when you and I, Michelle, are doing our decolonization work, it's like, it's just going to take time and giving ourselves enough grace and honor of like honoring the time that it takes instead of rushing it or trying to get there sooner, faster, more efficiently. Let it be artful instead That I feel like that could potentially be a good substitute.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Do we have like a second for me to kind of give an example of like a what not to do real quick?
Yes. Always space for that. Please do.
Okay, so I've talked about how I've rushed my process and how I was like, I just need this internalized depression out now. But equally along with that, the thing is, when we rush our process, we don't get the depth of learning that we need.
Yeah.
Right. And so I've done that time and time again. And that's why, like, I'll start at level 1 and then I'll be like, no, I'm good. I can jump to level 5. But what happens? I go back to level 1 because there's something that I didn't pick up there that I needed to pick up. Right. So that's why we say, like, take this process slow and it's okay. Because if we rush through it, there's so many golden nuggets, parts of self, pieces of self that are going to be missed, and you'll have to come back for it anyway. So
yeah,
it's okay to just slow the shit down.
Yep.
And enjoy the process.
Yeah. Or don't.
Or don't. Yeah. Or don't. Yeah, because it's real.
Or find it painful.
Oh my gosh. Yes. So much pain. Because I acknowledge that I can say that I enjoy it now, but oh no, when I was posing that question to my therapist, there was anger. Like, why?
Yeah, it hurts.
But yes.
Uncomfortable.
Yes. Mm-hmm. But I'm going to note that is I enjoyed the pain. No, because that still isn't that right. I enjoy the pain now because it birthed something beautiful.
Yeah. There's total appreciation for that pain.
Yes.
It was pain with a purpose.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
All right. Shall we close this again with another minute? Shall we do that? All right. So, Michelle, my loves of our kapatids and addings, please sit nice and comfortable or lay nice and comfortable and then find a comfortable position for your eyes. And take a couple of deep breaths. Just get in touch with your inhale and your exhale and all the sensations and sounds that come with it. And then for a full minute, you'll focus on the sound and sensation of your breath. And if you catch your focus wandering, just gently pull it back to your breath. And again, gentle like a cloud. Your minute starts now. And time.
Beautiful. Well, my parts feel held right now.
Yay. Good. All right. Well, I will talk to you later. I love you, Michelle.
Love you, sis.